take a look at the origins of progressive movement, which take place between on the turn of the 20th century, between 1900 and 1920. By the end of these notes, you should be able to once again answer the 5 learning objectives. 1. Explain how problems of the Gilded Age led to progressivism. 2. Describe the impact of muckrakers during the Gilded Age. 3. Explain the 4 goals of progressivism. 4. Summarize progressive effort to clean up government. 5. Identify progressive effort to reform state government, protect workers, and reform elections. 6. Describe the growing presence of women in the workforce at the turn of the 20th century. 7. Identify leaders of the women's suffrage movement. And 8. Explain how women's suffrage was achieved. All right, let's begin. This is a quick review. Again, the Gilded Age. During this time, we often refer to it as a period of robber barons or industrial statesmen. Again, during the second phase of the Industrial Revolution in American history, we see tremendous growth in corporations' industrialization, as we saw in previous weeks. And Mark Twain and Warner call it the era of greed and corruption. Keep in mind, during this time, there was little local government control. Oftentimes, political machines and bosses ran the local governments. Oftentimes, when the immigrants came across during, again, this second major era of immigration, they often depended upon political machines and bosses for various infrastructural needs within their communities. And oftentimes, the immigrants were guided by these political bosses who were second generation immigrants themselves. During this time, we also had weak presidents dating back to the corruption of Ulysses S. Grant, and then following it all the way up to when we look at William McKinley. Political machines, again, they were chosen candidates. Oftentimes, the power resided in the precinct captains, but oftentimes we see publicly the political bosses receiving much of the notoriety regarding running these political machines. And again, they influence voters to vote them in office in election years. They did it through intimidation. They did it through bribery, and political bosses bribed politicians. Corruption at the top, as I already mentioned with Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, again, we see cornering the gold market. We see granting of railroad land, and then we see the whiskey tax bribery. And also, he brings about the spoils system. And remember back to how the spoils system began with the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. Also, presidents, Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, who again only served a month in office, followed by Chester Arthur, and then we see Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. All right, so we see the populist movement. Again, this is revisiting what we've learned in previous weeks. Farmers facing problems, high supply, low prices, machinery costs and shipping rates increase, and also shipping rates between states was an issue. Loans are very expensive during this time, and we see the form of the national range encourages cooperation amongst farmers and pushes to regulate freight on trains. We see the Farmers Alliance during this time, again offering low cost insurance for all farmers. And they wanted to print money with both silver and gold. But remember, the Populist Party, the closer it gets to a president, is going to be elected officials in Congress, and the Populist Party dies simply because of the economic conditions better after the Panic of 1893. Again, U.S. converted to the gold standard. Increase the number of bills in circulation, thus increasing inflation. And then we see William McKinley largely wins during this time because of the backing of what we referred to earlier as the industrial statesmen or robber barons, people like J.P. Morgan, John Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt. All right, again, the Panic of 1893. Again, we see the social effects. Other issues we see during this time, we see again the problem of alcoholism. This is led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Again, we see the origination of this prohibition back to the Seneca Falls in the mid-1800s. And then it's, again, reintroduced here at the turn of the 20th century. Again, the Women's Christian Union was spirited the crusade for prohibition. Members advanced their cause by entering saloons, singing, praying, and urging saloon keepers to stop selling alcohol. As the momentum grew, we eventually see the prohibition, which is going to be proposed in the 18th Amendment, which we talked about last week, again prohibiting later, passed in 1919, prohibiting the sale, manufacture, and distribution of liquor. But that, again, 18th Amendment would be repealed with the 22nd Amendment, thus creating the sale, distribution, and manufacture of liquor and alcohol legal in 1933. Woodrow Wilson will be the last president of the Prohibition, or the Progressive era, serving 2 terms. He'll reduce tariffs, again increasing global exchange of economic goods and services. In graduate income tax, we'll see the first federal income tax under his watch. He'll create the Federal Reserve Bank. He'll create a Federal Reserve Board, where he'll appoint president, and regional banks as well that will again loan to individual banks and sustain viable places to put public's money. Women's suffrage we see growing during this time. We see the National American Women's Suffrage Association, again the NAWSA, is one of the, well, along with the WCTA, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, were 2 notable unions that work towards women's suffrage. Again, we see notable players during this time. We'll talk a little bit about them later. Again, they were supported in World War I, and then we see the 19th Amendment passed. Again, that's the Women's Suffrage Amendment passed in 1920. All right, progressivism, again, the 20 years I mentioned earlier, the 4 goals, again, we're looking at protecting social welfare, promoting moral improvement, creating economic reform, and fostering efficiency. We look at protecting social reform, again, we're looking at protecting women, we're looking at expanding libraries, sponsoring classes, and ending slum settlements or tenements. We see protecting also what we talked about earlier with social reform, that being prohibition. We see moral improvement. Again, moral improvement is going to be largely led by muckrakers and the reforming of the morality of Americans and the degradation of American society. Economic reform is going to be seen in, which we'll look at a little bit later, but it's going to be seen in again, eliminating the capitalist economic system, or finding a way to have a mixed market, what we now refer to as mixed market. Eliminate, and also we'll see the rise of a socialist party in the 1900s. And we'll see fostering efficiency, and again, that really resides with government in creating various levels of government. All right, you can see right here with the quote of Upton Sinclair. As you can see, Upton Sinclair was talking about the harsh working conditions, again, during the time of progressivism. All right, again, progressivism. Again, just to kind of reiterate what was said earlier, and the roots of it will be found in the Gilded Age, which we began the presentation with. Okay, again, the purpose. All right, creating orderly change, again, which I referred to as the 4 main goals. And again, curing the ailments of the widening gap of economic distribution, or distribution of wealth during this time. Again, where we see the wealthy industrial statesmen growing in economic strength. Meanwhile, the workers losing, not only getting paid insufficient wages, but also working in conditions that are less than sanitary or desirable.
Come out.
All right, progressives came from a large spectrum of society. Again, they're advocating reform. And we'll talk about some of these major religious leaders, feminists, and politicians. Look at some of the heavy hitters: Ida Tarbell and the Standard Oil Company, which we'll talk about later as well. We see Upton Sinclair attacking the production of food. Florence Kelley, again, advocating for women's suffrage. Robert La Follette, again, attacking the political system and calling for direct elections and recall. Teddy Roosevelt and President Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt's Square Deal, and Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom. James Adam, again, looking at women reform as well as social institutional reform. Muckrakers, again, journalists that exposed the harsh conditions of our economic system. Ida Tarbell attacking John D. Rockefeller, and journalist ads that talked about the corruption of Standard Oil. They questioned the economic and political systems. We see Thomas Nast, again, popularizes the elephant and the donkey, the Republican elephant and the Democratic donkey. And oftentimes, through historical viewpoint, he is the one being credited for bringing down Boss Tweed in Tammany Hall. Again, a political boss and one of the political machines. And oftentimes, their cartoons are political cartoons, and they often catered to the entire population, whether they were literate or illiterate. Okay, again, so oftentimes what we do, I just want to point out the last bullet point. Some of these, obviously, we've talked about them before, and you can further read about them in your text, but many times progressivists fought for economic reform, social reform, political reform, but they did not fight for equality. What I mean by equality is racial equality, specifically black Americans during this time. Okay, again, taking on corruption. Again, Robert La Follette will create the direct primary, direct election of senators, a secret ballot, and democratic laws. Okay, so again, city reform. Under the progressive Republican leadership of Robert La Follette, from Wisconsin, he'll drive for broad reform. He'll explain as the governor, he did not want to mean to smash the corporations, but merely drive them out of politics. So again, separating business from politics. The main target was the railroad industry under Robert La Follette. He taxed railroad property at the same rate as other business properties, set up a commission to regulate rates, and thus creating a more efficient political system, separating it from businesses. Again, he creates examples of nonpartisanism, as well as city management, a hierarchy within the local government. All right, you'll have many writs. Focus again. The Wisconsin idea. Again, the Wisconsin idea is going to be led by regulating big businesses and the laboratory of democracy. Again, increasing the role of public within creating various initiatives such as a referendum, which is legislated where voters can reject or accept a vote. He'll create the recall, enabling voters to remove public officials from elected positions. And also, during this time, the 17th Amendment is passed in the Constitution. Before each state's legislator had been chosen by the United States Senators. which put even more power in the hands of party bosses and wealthy corporation heads. To force senators to be more responsive to the public, progressives pushed for the popular election of senators. At first, the Senate refused to allow this idea, but gradually more and more states began to allowing voters to nominate senators candidates in direct primaries. Again, constituents made up of states selecting their senators, which we see today. We see women in public life. Most women in the South and Midwest, women's roles had changed substantially. Since the previous century, in addition to household tasks such as cooking, making clothes, and laundering, farm women handled a host of other chores, like raising livestock. They also helped plow, plant fields, and harvest the crops. Women started to enter the industry during this time, where we see 1 in 5 women making up the workforce. Also, in 1890, women high school graduate they outnumbered men, so we see the growing of education. We also see new women colleges emerge. Vassar College, with a faculty of 8 men and 22 women, accepted the first students in 1865. Smith and Wesley College followed in 1875, and then Columbia, Brown, and Harvard colleges refused to admit women. Each university established a separate college for women. In the late 19th century, marriage was no longer a women's only alternative. Many women entered the workforce or sought higher education. In fact, more than almost half of college-educated women in the 19th century never married, retaining their own independence. Many of these educated women began to fight for social reform. Not only fight for them, but now they had the social skills, or the raw skills. We see them attacking issues such as women were not allowed to hold office, they were not allowed to run for office. We also see, again, a lot of these movements led by Susan B. Anthony, a proponent of women's suffrage, the right to vote. She said, "I would sooner cut off my right hand than ask the ballot for a black man and not for a woman." In 1869, Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton had formed the NWSA, again, the National Women's Suffrage Association, which united women in this movement or front to establish the 19th Amendment. Again, the 19th Amendment will pass, granting all women the right to vote in 1920. Triangular shirtwaist fire. Sorry, the video isn't working right now. All right, take a look at the quick review. And then, as always, at the end of the notes, please go back to the learning objectives and make sure that you completely answer them with historical facts and events. And then begin the activity for this week.